Dachau, a name that still sends shivers down your spine today. It was the first Nazi concentration camp, the sinister school where the art of horror was perfected. Here, people didn't just incarcerate, they experimented. Within its walls, prisoners were reduced to mere numbers, stripped of their identities, subjected to forced labor, torture, and medical experiments so cruel they seem impossible to believe. It was a laboratory of evil, where new forms of killing and methods to break the human mind and body were tested. The chimneys belched smoke, and the smell of death permeated the air, mingling with the muffled screams that the night couldn't hide. Dachau wasn't just a camp, it was the model for an entire system of terror, and its darker side is even more disturbing than the official story usually tells us. Today, we're going to enter that place and discover what really happened behind its barbed wire. The birth of the first Nazi camp. The birth of the Dachau concentration camp was born almost at the same time as the Nazi regime. It was officially opened on March 22, 1933, just a few weeks after Adolf Hitler assumed the office of Chancellor of Germany. At that time, the Nazi extermination machine was not yet in motion, but the foundations were already being laid for a system of totalitarian repression that would soon spread like a plague across Europe. Dachau was built on the outskirts of the small Bavarian town of the same name, just 16 kilometers from Munich. The choice of location was not a whim. Bavaria was a historical bastion of National Socialism, and Munich had witnessed many of its early stages, including the failed beer hall putsch of 1923. Furthermore, the location boasted a key element for its future function, a rail connection that allowed for the rapid transport of prisoners from anywhere in Germany. The camp's first commandant was Theodor Eicke, a man who embodied the brutality and iron discipline the SS sought to impose. Eicke didn't just run Dachau, he transformed it into a laboratory of terror. He drafted internal regulations that institutionalized violence, humiliation, and punishment as part of everyday life. Under his command, prisoners were subjected to endless formations in the sun or snow, arbitrary physical punishment, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture designed to break their will. In its first months, Dachau was not exclusively intended for Jews, although some were already sent there. The first to fill its barracks were primarily political opponents: communists, social democrats, trade unionists, journalists critical of the regime, and even Catholic priests who dared to denounce Nazi injustices from the pulpit. The objective was clear: to crush any pockets of resistance before the new government consolidated its power. Over time, the camp grew in both size and brutality. Beginning in 1938, following Kristallnacht, prisoners began arriving en masse: Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and anyone else the Nazi authorities labeled undesirable or enemy of the people. Dachau then became a veritable laboratory for the Nazi concentration camp system. New forms of slave labor, torture methods, control techniques, and medical experiments of unimaginable cruelty, such as tests for resistance to freezing, altitude, and poisoning, were experimented there. Another crucial aspect was its administration. Dachau was under the direct control of the SS, not the regular army. This gave it almost absolute autonomy. It functioned as a state within a state, with its own regulations, internal courts, and summary punishments. Furthermore, it became the main training center for concentration camp guards. Thousands of SS members passed through Dachau to learn how to handle prisoners, administer punishments, organize forced labor, and execute without hesitation. Once trained in this school of cruelty, they were sent to other camps in the Reich to replicate the same model of horror. By 1945, Dachau was no longer just a camp. It was the symbolic and operational heart of the entire concentration camp system of the Third Reich. Founded in 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power, it was initially conceived as a center for political prisoners, but it was soon transformed into a laboratory for social control and repression. There, methods were designed, tested, and perfected that would later be exported to Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, and other sites of horror. Its administrative structure and regulations became the standard model for all Nazi camps. The forced labor system, the prisoner hierarchy with its feared kapos, the routine of humiliation and punishment, the organization of the barracks, even the indirect extermination protocols, hunger, exhaustion, untreated illnesses, were all tested and optimized at Dachau before being replicated on a massive scale. Over its years of operation, the camp expanded to include more than 140 sub-camps, most of them dedicated to slave labor for the German war industry, arms factories, munitions workshops, quarries, and construction projects. Between the main camp and its outbuildings, it is estimated that more than 200,000 prisoners from 34 different countries passed through its barbed wire. First Nazi camp. Jews, political prisoners, Catholic priests, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, all were thrown into the same wheel of exploitation and death. Tens of thousands perished there, whether from summary executions, epidemic diseases, extreme hunger, physical exhaustion, or as victims of the infamous medical experiments that transformed human beings into laboratory material. Dachau was also the scene of mass shootings of Soviet prisoners, and the site where methods of systematic physical and psychological torture were applied. Most disturbing is that Dachau, more than just a camp, was a prototype. It wasn't just a place of confinement, it was a training center for SS officers. Those who served there learned not only how to administer a camp, but also how to dehumanize prisoners, viewing them as work units or experimental cases, never as people. From Dachau, this criminal know-how was exported to the entire network of concentration and extermination camps in the Reich. When American troops liberated it on April 29, 1945, they found thousands of piled-up corpses, gaping mass graves, and skeletal prisoners barely able to stand. The sight was so shocking that many soldiers could not hold back their tears. And some, according to testimony, summarily executed captured guards, unable to bear what they had seen. Dachau's legacy is etched in history as the place where Germany perfected the art of repression and organized death. It was, in the words of some survivors, the school of hell. And although the physical camp has been dismantled, its imprint lives on as a warning. There it was demonstrated that murder can become routine and that barbarism can be administered with bureaucratic discipline. The origin of experiments. Over the course of 12 years, medicine under the Third Reich was transformed from a practice intended to heal into a precise machine at the service of destruction. Under the banner of progress and the false cloak of scientific research, healthy bodies were deliberately infected. Limbs were amputated without a single drop of anesthetic. Men and women were submerged alive in ice until their bodies surrendered to the cold. Lethal viruses were injected with the precision of someone administering a simple medicine. Pregnant women were forced to give birth and then their children murdered before their eyes. Twins were sewn together in grotesque experiments. Skulls were opened without sedation. Lungs saturated with infection were used to test useless vaccines. Prisoners were forced to drink seawater until thirst tore them apart from within, and bodies burning with malaria were observed as if they were laboratory specimens. They were not patients, they were not human beings in the eyes of those who handled them. They were prisoners, they were objects. They were Jews, gypsies, communists, homosexuals, the disabled political opponents, and even children. In the camps, the white coat replaced the uniform, the scalpel, the bullet, and the Hippocratic oath. This was not a chapter in science, it was a moral autopsy of humanity. In this universe without ethics, the science of the Reich did not seek to cure, but to dominate. Turned into another cog in the genocidal machinery, medicine degraded into a meticulous and systematic crime. Between barbed wire, watchtowers, and starving bodies, the darkest pages of human experimentation were written, always protected by the SS and carried out with the same bureaucratic rigor applied to the transport of prisoners or the administration of a camp. One of the most infamous scenarios of this scientific perversion was the hypothermia experiments at the Dachau concentration camp. For 9 months, between August 1942 and May 1943, dozens of prisoners, Russians, Poles, Germans, Jews, Catholics, and atheists, were used as guinea pigs for a series of studies whose supposed purpose was to find methods to save German airmen shot down in the North Sea. The facade was scientific. The reality, an utter disregard for human life. Immersed in tanks of ice-cold water, some prisoners were anesthetized, but most were forced to remain conscious to document every moment of their agony. Naked or dressed in Luftwaffe uniforms, their resistance depended not on the usefulness of the research, but on the whim of the doctors who, stopwatch in hand, recorded the exact moment life snuffed out. Rectal temperature was measured down to the last heartbeat. Skin turned grey, lips blue. The bodies trembled uncontrollably until exhaustion left them motionless, floating like corpses before being removed. Some were rewarmed with blankets, heat lamps, or lukewarm baths. Others, in an attempt as desperate as it was aberrant, were forced into forced sexual intercourse under the theory that human warmth could save them. Still others were simply left to die in order to obtain complete data on the limits of human endurance. At the center of this horror was one name, Dr. Sigmund Rascher, an ambitious and ruthless physician and personal protege of Heinrich Himmler. For him, each prisoner was a number on a list, an opportunity to gain prestige in the Nazi apparatus and secure his place among the Reich's scientists. Under his direction, Dachau was not only a concentration camp, but also a laboratory of death where science and barbarism became blurred to the point of being indistinguishable. Rasher not only directed the experiments, he falsified data, manipulated reports, and constantly pressured his superiors to obtain more prisoners who could serve as experimental material. His career was a mixture of sadism and opportunism, shielded by the protection of the Reichsführer of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who saw him as a pioneer of military medicine. Rascher's official reports were co-signed by Dr. Ernst Holzlerner, a university professor and doctor, Sigmund Finker, a close associate of the SS. The most detailed document that has survived, known as the Dachau Report and dated October 21, 1942, was personally delivered to Himmler. Within its pages, the temperatures, times, and physiological reactions observed during the hypothermia sessions are meticulously recorded. However, there is no room for screaming in that report. It doesn't mention how eyes glazed over, how nails tore as they desperately scraped the icy metal, or how bodies convulsed before going inert. After the war, those responsible tried to justify these horrors under the guise of a supposed scientific duty. American Dr. Andrew Ivy, a representative at the Nuremberg trials, completely dismissed this work, calling it pseudoscience devoid of any real value. Psychiatrist Leo Alexander initially thought the data might be useful, but horrified by the methods, he flatly retracted his statement. Even so, the shadow of Dachau has not entirely dissipated. Since 1984, more than 45 scientific publications have cited the results obtained there. A disturbing reality that demonstrates how, even decades later, the echoes of these crimes continue to be projected over science and historical memory. Some researchers have accepted them with reservations, others with disturbing enthusiasm. Physiologists, such as Robert Pozos, have defended the potential usefulness of such data in saving lives in cases of extreme hypothermia. At the other extreme, voices such as that of physician Arnold Relman categorically reject their use, arguing that any knowledge arising from a crime is, by definition, an affront to science itself. The debate within the scientific community remains open. It is not only a question of ethics, but also of the actual validity of the results. Many records are incomplete, riddled with inconsistencies, or downright falsified. The Nazis attempted to erase their trail, burning archives, destroying documents, and eliminating evidence, but were not entirely successful. Reports, letters, affidavits, and even photographs survived. In his private communications with Himmler, Rascher described every figure, every reaction, every success according to his twisted vision. This aseptic, supposedly clinical language was not proof of advanced science, but written evidence of meticulous barbarity executed with the bureaucratic precision of the Third Reich. Experimenting with pain, science in the service of evil. The Dachau hypothermia experiment did not originate in university classrooms or legitimate laboratories. It was not born out of genuine scientific concern or a research protocol approved by academic committees. Its genesis was political and ideological, the fruit of a Third Reich obsessed with racial supremacy, the cult of sacrifice, and the ambition to subject nature to human will, even if it meant destroying lives in the process. The initial idea came from Field Marshal Erhard Milch, a senior Luftwaffe commander concerned about the high mortality rate of German pilots who fell into the icy waters of the North Sea. Milch requested effective methods to prolong survival and facilitate rescue. On paper, the proposal seemed like a practical defensive measure. In reality, it morphed into a torture laboratory. The request was enthusiastically received by Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the SS, who saw in it not only a military project but also an opportunity to expand the scope of his human experiments in the concentration camps. Instead of entrusting the project to an accredited medical institute or specialists in physiology, Himmler entrusted it to one of his personal protégés, Dr. Sigmund Rascher. The choice was not based on scientific merit. Rasher was neither a recognized researcher nor an expert in military medicine, but on his absolute loyalty to the regime and his brutal willingness to use human bodies as experimental material. He was an unscrupulous opportunist, capable of disguising sadism under the language of science. To give him a facade of legitimacy, Himmler brought in two nominal collaborators, Dr. Holzlerner and Dr. Finke, academics with respectable degrees who, in theory, were supposed to supervise the work. In practice, their role was decorative. Visits were sporadic, and the true authority resided entirely with Rasher, who operated without external control, improvising methods and altering records. The charade was short-lived. Barely 2 months later, Holzlerner and Finke withdrew, declaring the research concluded. Rasher, however, refused to accept the closure. He continued the tests unilaterally, conducting more than 350 additional sessions under the pretext that he needed more data for his doctoral thesis. By then, the supposed goal of saving pilots had been reduced to an excuse. What he really sought was to consolidate his career and earn a position at the Nazi university. Himmler, a man with no medical training but obsessed with biological and racial theories, became directly involved. Under his authority, no human experiment was carried out without his personal approval. He not only authorized it, he intervened, demanded results, proposed theories, and even suggested specific methods. If he deemed a test inconclusive, he ordered it to be repeated. His presence at Dachau was not symbolic. He would stand in front of the ice water tanks, silently observing the prisoners' suffering and occasionally commenting or adjusting procedures. He was the modern inquisitor. He didn't need fire, he had ice. The project became a private experiment between a bureaucrat with absolute power and a doctor aspiring to notoriety, carried out in a setting where there were no ethical boundaries or real oversight. When some Wehrmacht medical officers attempted to investigate, disturbed by rumors about Dachau, their warnings were ignored or stifled. Himmler shielded the program as a state secret, and any attempt at oversight was interpreted as political betrayal. Thus, for months, human bodies were repeatedly submerged in ice water, naked or in flight uniforms, while chronometers recorded their agony. In Rascher's mind, each death was a stepping stone to academic prestige. In Himmler's case, a confirmation that the human body could be molded, manipulated, and destroyed like any other tool of the Reich. And in the icy silence of Dachau, what was being forged was not knowledge, but one of the darkest and most degrading chapters in the history of medicine. The myth of scientific rigor that Nazi doctors wielded as a moral shield collapses as soon as the actual structure of the hypothermia experiment at Dachau is examined. The famous Dachau report, presented as a technical and objective compilation, is far from it. It is nothing more than a jumble of imprecise descriptions, deliberate omissions, and incomplete data, more resembling a hasty draft than a medical research document. There are no exact figures for the total number of victims, nor a clear record of the frequency or context in which exposures to the cold occurred. The only way to reconstruct the events was through the testimonies collected after the war, which revealed a terrifying picture. Between 280 and 300 prisoners were subjected in total to between 360 and 400 immersion sessions. This means that dozens of men were repeatedly used as experimental material until their exhausted bodies became worthless to researchers. They were even denied the right to a quick death. The torture was measured out, repeated, and prolonged as much as possible to extract as much data. The report omits essential aspects. There is no reference to the prisoners' ages, their previous state of health, their physical condition, or their degree of malnutrition, a factor that radically altered their resistance to the cold. Nor is there a distinction made between those who were exposed naked and those who remained clothed, nor is it specified who was anesthetized and who was forced to endure the torture consciously so that their reactions could be observed with almost theatrical precision. Even the most basic information is presented in absurdly wide ranges, from 2 to 12 degrees Celsius, without detailing how many subjects were exposed to each variation or for what specific purpose. Whether it was intended to measure survival time, determine lethal body temperature, record the onset of arrhythmias, or simply prolong agony for study as a macabre spectacle. The experiment included at least 7 different rewarming methods, but none is described in sufficient technical detail to be reproduced or scientifically evaluated. The type of heat source used, its intensity, or the exact time elapsed from the time the prisoner was removed from the icy water until the start of rewarming is not specified. In only 2 cases is the temperature of the lukewarm baths used mentioned. A witness, a laboratory assistant, revealed years later that some prisoners were thrown directly into containers of boiling water, causing severe burns before hypothermia dealt the final blow. But even in that hell, there were small acts of quiet rebellion. Some assistants, medical interns, and prisoners forced to collaborate attempted to subtly sabotage the tests, altering temperature measurements, shortening immersion times, or delaying blood draws, hoping to produce inconclusive results that would force the session to be suspended. These gestures, imperceptible to outside observers, were acts of moral resistance that, while unable to stop the machinery, perhaps saved a few lives. No one knows how many. Medical follow-up, meanwhile, was rudimentary to the point of being grotesque. Blood pressure was not systematically recorded, and cardiac monitoring was virtually non-existent. What was precisely documented were the stages of suffering: tremors, loss of consciousness, irregular breathing, rigidity, dilated pupils, symptoms noted as if they were mere chemical reactions, ignoring the fact that behind each piece of data was a human being in the process of dying. On paper, the experiment was presented as a breakthrough for science and the survival of pilots. In reality, it was an exercise in planned cruelty, disguised as research, lacking the most basic methodology and tainted by the ideology of a regime that viewed human life as a disposable resource. Only a few isolated heart sounds and electrocardiograms so rudimentary they barely deserved the name were recorded. During the convulsions and the uncontrollable shaking of the submerged bodies, the devices failed to capture a legible tracing. None of these records were ever useful for rigorous analysis. Potentially lethal arrhythmias, such as ventricular fibrillation or strokes, were never documented in real time. The victims died, and not even the perpetrators themselves could state with certainty what exact physiological event had ended their lives. Everything that constitutes the basis of scientific research worthy of the name was absent. There was no careful selection of variables, no methodological consistency, no reproducible data, no clear and precise documentation. No reliable tables or comparative graphs were produced. There were no uniform protocols that would allow the results to be replicated. Instead, what we find are scattered fragments, disconnected figures, and conclusions written to please Himmler in order to obtain more funding, more prisoners, and more time to continue the torture machinery disguised as research. And yet, decades later, some continue to call this science, as if it were possible to separate the method from its purpose, as if pure, clean, innocent knowledge could be extracted from a planned crime. But upon closer examination of the Dachau experimental design, the facade crumbles. It was not medical research, but a liturgy of death executed with thermometers and stopwatches, but without logic, without truth, and without an iota of humanity. The so-called Dachau report does not stand up to serious examination. Instead of offering replicable evidence, it is riddled with claims that contradict decades of consolidated physiological knowledge. A particularly revealing example: the document claimed that neither anesthesia nor water temperature, which ranged from 2 to 12 degrees Celsius, influenced the body's cooling rate. Such a statement not only contradicts what human physiology has repeatedly demonstrated, but also evidences a conscious manipulation of facts to support a narrative convenient to the regime. The confusion intensifies when reviewing the documentation of cardiac arrhythmias. The record is limited to vague qualifiers such as slow, fast, or irregular, without resorting to standard medical nomenclature. Ventricular fibrillation is not mentioned, despite being the leading cause of death from hypothermia, nor atrial fibrillation, which is the most common in these cases. The only technical term used, atrial flutter, appears to be applied incorrectly, describing a tracing that actually corresponded to fibrillation. This diagnostic clumsiness or deliberate distortion reveals two equally disturbing possibilities: an absolute ignorance of cardiac physiology or a homicidal indifference to scientific truth and human life. The report also refers to the after-drop phenomenon, the continued drop in body temperature even after the subject is removed from icy water, a process that can precipitate death. However, the accompanying graphs are inconsistent. In some cases, the drop appears after a specific point. In others, it does not. There is no explanation whatsoever about the conditions that determined its presence or absence. Consequently, what is presented is not a scientific analysis, but a disordered accumulation of figures that point to a prefabricated conclusion. Even the most crucial piece of data is rife with contradiction and lies. In certain passages, it is insinuated that death occurs when body temperature drops below 27 degrees Celsius. In others, the limit is set at 25 degrees Celsius or even lower. There is no consensus, no method. What is present is a constant: the absolute disregard for human life, reduced to a number on a page, a dispensable variable. This lack of rigor was not the result of the technical incompetence of the time. Medicine in the 1940s already had sufficient tools to accurately measure core temperature, heart rate, and other vital parameters. What was lacking at Dachau was not technology, but a willingness to do science. Because doing science demands respect for the truth and for the subject of study. And at Dachau, the prisoners were not subjects, but objects, disposable bodies whose suffering required no justification. The end result was not a medical breakthrough, but an incomplete and falsified record of a series of slow executions camouflaged by clinical language. An assistant testified years later that some prisoners were cooled to a core temperature of 25 degrees Celsius. Rasher, for his part, maintained that all those who dropped below 28 degrees Celsius died. The main report, on the other hand, sets the supposed lethal zone between 26 and 27 degrees Celsius, with a few exceptions. Later, almost contradictorily, the document itself admits that in 6 fatal experiments, the terminal temperature ranged between 24.2 and 25.7 degrees Celsius. And to top off the confusion, the table that should support this data shows openly that death occurred at temperatures between 25.7 and 29.2 degrees Celsius. In other words, no one knew for sure what Rascher's threshold of death was, and worse still, no one seemed to want to know. There is no trace of information about how many of the 80 or 90 documented deaths reached those values, nor about the ages of the victims, their previous state of health, or even whether they had eaten in the preceding days. It is not specified whether they died clothed or naked, nor how long they spent in the icy water before succumbing. The individual conditions of each experiment are deliberately blurred in a sea of omissions and falsifications, as if the methodological chaos were part of a plan to hide the true magnitude of the barbarity. One of the few points on which the testimonies collected after the war agree is that only 2 prisoners survived the tests, and both were scarred for life with irreversible psychiatric consequences. Their bodies partially recovered, but their minds remained forever trapped in that torture chamber disguised as a laboratory. The rewarming techniques applied at Dachau were treated with a lethal mix of negligence and cynicism. The report describes 3 groups of experiments and states that the hot bath was the most effective method of restoring life. However, it never specifies how many trials were conducted, the characteristics of the victims, or the exact temperature of the water used. In real science, such data are essential. At Dachau, they were irrelevant. The contradictions are constant. In one graph, the treatment concludes with massage and electric heat, although the corresponding text mentions only the hot bath. In another case, it is claimed that no treatment was applied for 12 minutes after being removed from the ice water. However, the accompanying temperature curve remains completely flat without the expected post-immersion drop, suggesting manipulation or falsification of the record. The text indicates that the bath lasted 10 minutes, but the corresponding table says 20. Nothing fits except the intention to present results that justify Rascher's previous hypotheses. Most seriously, at no point is the survival rate reported, nor is the effectiveness of one method compared to another. The official conclusion is not based on real evidence, but on a self-serving narrative. In fact, a post-war report revealed that numerous victims died immediately after being thrown into vats of boiling water. This suggests that the most effective method was, in fact, the most lethal. There is no evidence whatsoever that the hot bath was safe. There was no cardiovascular monitoring or recording of hemodynamic parameters that would have identified arrhythmias or circulatory failure, obvious risks in sudden resuscitation. And yet, the report boldly claims that no adverse effects were recorded, a claim so absurd that it could not even be sustained under the limited medical knowledge of the 1940s. Ultimately, the so-called Dachau report is not a scientific document. It is a propaganda device cloaked in medical jargon. It does not seek to uncover the truth or improve medicine. It seeks to justify torture and death. The apparent disorganization of the data, the inexplicable gaps, and the arbitrary conclusions are not the product of carelessness, but of a deliberate desire to erase any trace that might demonstrate that these experiments were, in essence, meticulous executions disguised as research. To justify the deaths, Rascher presented an explanation that was intended to sound scientific. He claimed they were due to heart failure caused by intense peripheral vasoconstriction and irreversible structural damage to the myocardium caused by extreme cold. According to him, the heart literally broke due to the effects of internal freezing. It was a dramatic enough image to impress Himmler and the rest of the Nazi hierarchy, but it was completely false. Not a single autopsy exists to support such a claim. There are no autopsy records, no histological reports, and no clinical evidence of acute heart failure. And contemporary medicine categorically refutes this. Decades of studies have shown that cold does not destroy the heart, but paradoxically protects it. Induced hypothermia is still used today as a technique in cardiac surgery to preserve myocardial tissue and reduce damage due to lack of oxygen. Had a rigorous histopathological examination of the victim's hearts been performed, the lie would have collapsed in seconds, but no one was there to search for the truth. The sole objective was to keep alive a fiction convenient for the Reich, even if it cost dozens of lives. The manipulation of data and concepts does not end there. Another claim in the report borders on the absurd, even by the pseudo-scientific standards of the time, that breathing could continue for up to 20 minutes after cardiac arrest. This claim is a physiological aberration. The human body does not breathe spontaneously when the heart stops beating, and any residual muscular activity after circulatory collapse lasts only seconds. Attributing prolonged breathing to a corpse is not a misinterpretation. It is a deliberate falsification, as blatant as the other manipulations present in the document. The farce reaches a grotesque point when one of Himmler's personal hypotheses enters the picture. The Reichsführer, fascinated by the idea of optimizing the efficiency of cold executions, suggested that cooling could be accelerated by placing ice cubes on the nape of the neck and the back of the skull. Rasher, always eager to please his superiors, claimed to have verified the theory and presented graphs as proof. According to these records, victims died more quickly if their heads were completely submerged or if the ice was placed over that specific region. But the scientific reality is different. No serious research has shown that such a reduced body surface area has a significant impact on the speed of cooling or the likelihood of death from hypothermia. The brain and spinal cord are sensitive to cold, yes, but the overall rate of heat loss from the body depends on much broader factors, such as body mass, total exposure to water, and ambient temperature. Even contemporary experts like Gage and Harrington, reviewing the data years later, suggested that the alleged evidence was little more than carefully fabricated fabrications designed to please Himmler, and thus ensure that Rasher would obtain more funding and more prisoners for his experiments. At its core, every page of the Dachau report is a monument to the deliberate distortion of the truth, an amalgamation of medical fallacies, whimsical theories, and graphic so-called confirmations that, rather than providing knowledge, served only to cover up planned murders with the veneer of scientific research. What was presented as medical progress was nothing more than a choreography of death designed not to save lives, but to demonstrate Russia's blind obedience to the ideology and whims of the Nazi regime. Finally, the report maintained that deaths from hypothermia were accompanied by cerebral edema and hemorrhage. However, medical experience, both before and after World War II, starkly contradicts this assertion. Extreme cold doesn't swell the brain. it shrinks it. Cerebral edema is not among the recognized complications of hypothermia, whether caused by accident or induced in a laboratory. Cerebral hemorrhages, on the other hand, are extremely rare in these cases. If they did occur, they were most likely the result of factors other than the cold, blows against the metal of the tank, kicks from guards, or the violent impacts suffered by prisoners as they struggled in a final instinct to escape the icy water. At Dachau, the line between experimental injury and direct torture was completely blurred. There was no science, only brutality wrapped in graphs and charts. These experiments, conducted by what could be described without exaggeration as the Devil's Research Team, had as their central figure a man who presented himself as a pioneer of military medicine. In reality, he was a power-hungry opportunist, lacking in scruples and true medical rigor, who wore a white coat spattered with blood and death. Sigmund Rascher. Born in 1909, Rascher began his medical studies in 1930. 3 years later, still without graduating, he was already active in the Nazi Party and the SA. Ideologically fanatical but intellectually mediocre, his training was limited, merely an unpaid internship and 3 years as a volunteer surgical assistant. He was even temporarily expelled from the University of Munich on suspicion of communist sympathies, an act that would have been enough to ruin the career of any other aspiring doctor in Nazi Germany. But in the Third Reich, political convictions could be shaped, betrayed, or exchanged as long as one knew to whom to pay homage. Rasher understood perfectly. In that regime, blind obedience and flattery toward the hierarchy were worth far more than professional competence. He was a man who knew how to embrace power, even if it meant erasing his previous steps or even betraying his own blood. In 1939, this instinct for political survival reached a climax. Without hesitation, he denounced his own father, also a doctor, for criticizing the regime. The gesture, as cold as it was calculated, was rewarded with his entry into the SS, the organization that in just a few years would make him one of the most feared doctors in the concentration camps. That same year, his life and career became definitively intertwined with the Reich's repressive apparatus, and his name was forever sealed in the history of barbarism. He married Caroline Nini Diehl, a former cabaret singer 15 years his senior, known in Berlin's most intimate circles for her bohemian lifestyle and her ability to navigate the halls of power. She had been the personal secretary and, according to persistent rumors, the lover of Heinrich Himmler. That unlikely and strategic union was much more than a marriage. It was the key that would open the gates of hell for Rascher. A few days after the wedding, Rascher was received in person by the Reichsführer of the SS. The audience, carefully prepared by Nini, was the beginning of a tacit pact. During the meeting, Rascher handed her a report with a cold and bureaucratic title, Development and Solution of Some Tasks Assigned by the Reichsführer. During the conversation held on April 24, 1939, behind those impersonal words lay the seeds of a macabre collaboration that in just a few years would leave a trail of death and suffering difficult to fathom. Rascher quickly understood that in the Third Reich, unconditional obedience was the most valuable currency. There was no need to be brilliant, innovative, or even competent. The only essential thing was to carry out orders without question, no matter how atrocious. Himmler, charmed by the young doctor's docility, made him his personal protégé. This protection was so absolute that even Rascher's superiors treated him with a mixture of forced respect and genuine fear. A mediocre but untouchable doctor, he wielded almost unlimited power under the shadow of one of the most feared men in Germany. His scientific career became a catalogue of horrors disguised as research. In addition to the infamous hypothermia tests, Rasher directed the high-altitude experiments at Dachau. In these, between 70 and 80 prisoners died inside low-pressure chambers that simulated the atmosphere at 20,000 meters above sea level. Deprived of oxygen, bodies convulsed, eyes filled with blood, and victims suffered cerebral hemorrhages before dying. Rasher documented everything with morbid meticulousness, describing the death rattles and spasms as if they were simple laboratory variables, and then published the results with a satisfied smile. But his ambition knew no bounds. He approached Himmler with a revolutionary proposal, using plant extracts to cure cancer. When Deputy Minister of Public Health Kurt Blom suggested beginning trials on mice, Rascher retorted that animals were of no use for rapid results. He wanted to test directly on humans. Himmler, fascinated by the idea of finding a German cure for cancer, immediately approved. Thus was born an oncology research station at Dachau where pus was injected into tumors, infections were deliberately induced, and control groups were left to die without any treatment. In one of his most absurd and cruel experiments, the supposed remedy turned out to be nothing more than saline water dyed with fluorescent light to give it a scientific appearance. Another of his pet projects was Polygal, a pectin-based preparation that he claimed could stop internal and external bleeding, replace surgical clips, and shorten operating times. To test it, he amputated healthy limbs without anesthesia or caused war wounds by shooting prisoners in the chest and neck. He recorded the bleeding time, noted the reactions, and published enthusiastic conclusions, omitting, of course, the atrocious details of how those data were obtained. He convinced Himmler of its usefulness and founded a factory where the prisoners themselves, many of them maimed by his experiments, produced the substance. His goal was to make it the German alternative to penicillin, which the Allies were already beginning to use on the front lines. In each of these projects, Rasher combined the coldest brutality with an unusual ability to wrap horror in medical and technical language. His reports spoke of volunteers, experimental protocols, and promising results. But behind every line lay a crime. At Dachau, his name became synonymous with scientific torture, and his laboratory, a room where human life was worth no more than a number in a statistical table. One of the surviving prisoners declared that Rascher's obsession with Polygal had nothing medical about it. It was pure ambition disguised as science. He wasn't seeking to save lives, but rather his own name etched in history. He wanted fame, he wanted a prize, he wanted immortality, even if it was built on mutilated flesh, spilled blood, and frozen bodies. He was a monster, yes, but also a fraud who understood the power of a well-written lie in a report on official letterhead. His name circulated in the highest echelons of the Reich. He appeared in confidential reports and even in communications that reached Adolf Hitler, who read his supposed discoveries with enthusiasm and without the slightest critical spirit. However, in medical and academic circles, Rascher was seen as a textbook imposter. His scientific mask held up on the political front, but crumbled before the eyes of any truly knowledgeable specialist. On one occasion, Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician and president of the German Academy of Military Medicine, told him bluntly that his report on cold exposure was so deficient that, had it been presented by a student, he would have been expelled from the class without hesitation. German universities systematically rejected him. None wanted to grant him a professorship. And after the war, when an official book was published on the Third Reich's medical advances in aeronautics, an entire chapter was devoted to hypothermia experiments. But his name did not appear even once. In medical history, Rascher was a non-entity. In the history of horror, an absolute protagonist. While at Dachau he continued murdering in the name of science, Rascher developed a side business as grotesque as it was lucrative. He collected human skin from murdered prisoners to make wallets, boots, gloves, and even saddles. These macabre objects were sold to high-ranking officers or given as unique pieces to colleagues within the SS. In his hands, human life was worth nothing more than raw material for an experiment or a luxury accessory. But his most repugnant lie, and the one that would seal his fate, had nothing to do with medicine, but with the Nazi ideal of infinite fertility. Himmler was obsessed with the idea that Aryan women could continue giving birth into old age under the right conditions. Rascher, determined to further curry favor with his protector, began to present his elderly wife as a living example of this biological miracle. According to him, Nini had given birth to 3 healthy children in quick succession, defying all medical statistics. The charade collapsed during a supposed 4th pregnancy. Nini was arrested while attempting to kidnap a baby from a clinic. Under pressure, she confessed that none of the 3 previous children were hers. They had been bought or stolen. The news hit the SS leadership like a bombshell. Himmler, who had personally touted the Rascher miracle as proof of Aryan superiority, felt humiliated and betrayed. On April 9, 1944, Rascher was arrested on the direct orders of his former benefactor. The charges included kidnapping, scientific fraud, domestic murder, and embezzlement. There were no more reports that could save him, nor any contacts to turn to. He fell as quickly as he had risen, without trial and without defense, like so many of his victims. Ironically, the man who had sent hundreds to their deaths under cold, sealed orders died the same way. Just another prisoner, reduced to a number, executed in April 1945 along with his wife by the same regime that had protected him, elevated him, and turned him into a monster. The horror laboratory at Dachau. In the spring of 1942, the Dachau concentration camp ceased to be solely a punishment and extermination center and became a human experimentation laboratory directly serving the Luftwaffe and the SS. Under the official pretext of advancing aviation medicine and saving the lives of German pilots, a series of experiments began, not in a hospital or research center, but in prisoner barracks and makeshift wards, where pain was the only real measuring instrument. The first victims were Polish and Soviet prisoners, considered expendable by Nazi ideology. The stated objective was to study what would happen to a pilot falling from a high altitude without oxygen if shot down over enemy territory. The central tool was a portable pressure chamber designed to simulate the atmosphere at over 20,000 meters. The method was as simple as it was atrocious. Lock the prisoner in, seal the hatch, reduce the pressure, and watch. Watching the body begin to violently convulse, the lungs collapse from lack of oxygen, the blood vessels explode in the eyes until they turned into red balls ready to burst. Blood pooled in the head while urine and feces escaped uncontrollably. Some screamed, others simply lost consciousness, never to return. Of the 200 prisoners used, 80 died inside the capsule. The rest, weakened and marked by irreversible damage, were executed to erase all testimony. Not a single survivor remained to recount what had happened. That same year, between August 1942 and May 1943, a second phase began, the freezing experiments. The pretext now was to study the hypothermia suffered by pilots shot down over the North Sea or in icy areas. A total of 300 prisoners were subjected to extreme temperatures under conditions controlled only in the technical sense of the word, controlled to maximize suffering and record every reaction. Some were forced to stand naked in the open air in the middle of the Bavarian winter while the biting wind ripped their skin off in invisible strips. The uncontrollable trembling ended in a sudden collapse. Pupils dilated, pulses became imperceptible, and breathing became an invisible thread before disappearing. Others were submerged in tanks of icy water, surrounded by blocks of ice that pressed against their skin until it turned bruised and stiff. They remained there for hours, under the watchful eyes of doctors and assistants who precisely noted the exact minute when consciousness faded. When the heart began to fail, the next phase began: experimental rewarming. Techniques ranged from immersing them in hot water, sometimes at temperatures close to boiling, to rubbing the body with blankets or bare hands. Other times, the so-called animal method was used, forcing naked prisoners to embrace the dying person, forcing humiliating and desperate physical contact. Many did not survive the transition. They died of heat shock or sudden cardiac arrest. Everything was documented with bureaucratic coldness: graphs, tables, photographs, films. There was no compassion, only data, and most disturbing, everything was repeated over and over again because repetition was considered scientific validation. In October 1942, Sigmund Rascher presented these results at a medical conference in Nuremberg. Key figures were in the room, such as Hubertus Strughold, director of the Institute of Aviation Medicine, and Erich Hipke, Surgeon General of the Luftwaffe. They listened without interruption, without asking awkward questions, and at the end, they applauded. They applauded a man who had just described in an academic tone how he had slowly killed hundreds of human beings. They said it was useful science for the Reich. No one asked about the bodies. The nightmare did not end there. In July 1944, as the Third Reich began to feel the weight of the war against it, the experiments continued. But now with an even more sinister purpose: to test new methods of swift and silent execution, as well as to try out techniques to artificially prolong a prisoner's agony without killing them in order to obtain information or break wills. Toxic gases were used in doses calculated to produce convulsions without immediate loss of consciousness. Controlled drowning was tested with forced resuscitation, repeating the cycle several times on the same victim. Suffering became an end in itself, and Dachau, far from being just a concentration camp, established itself as an experimental torture center where pain was the raw material and death the inevitable consequence. As Germany attempted to recover from the Allied offensive, a new series of experiments began at Dachau, this time with the goal of finding a method to desalinate seawater so that pilots shot down over the ocean could survive. 90 Roma prisoners were forced to drink exclusively salt water for days without food. Some received the liquid directly into their veins. The pain was unbearable. Their bodies dehydrated from within. Organs collapsed, tongues cracked, stomachs swelled, eyes sank. Extreme thirst drove them insane. Many tried to drink their own urine, others crawled on the floor searching for moisture. Those who still survived were subjected to liver biopsies without anesthesia, all in the name of science, all with official seal. A thick needle was inserted between the ribs, penetrating directly into the liver to extract tissue fragments. Many prisoners died on the operating table, others died hours or days later, victims of infections, internal bleeding, or simply from neglect. The test drug called Berkatit was supposed to help the body process salt. In reality, it was ineffective, or worse, a mere placebo. No one survived because of it. Everyone died with it. Meanwhile, the data from each experiment traveled to the Institute of Aviation Medicine, where they were analyzed with the coldness of someone examining numbers, as if the extreme suffering of a man dehydrated to the point of delirium could be reduced to equations and statistical tables. All this occurred with the knowledge and tacit approval of the Luftwaffe's medical high command. Hubertus Strughold, who was present at conferences, signed reports, and had ties to those conducting the tests, was never prosecuted. After the war, he claimed to have known nothing, to have heard nothing, to have read the documents. He was placed under house arrest, released shortly after, and died without being held accountable for the crimes committed under his supervision. Others involved, Becker Freising, Hipke, Schreiber, were tried and convicted of crimes against humanity. But by then, there were no living witnesses or bodies left to speak. Only graphs, reports, and clinical notes remained, cold and dehumanized. Patient 28, death after 4th saline injection. Subject 36 died during liver biopsy. In those pages, water was transformed into the worst of poisons. During the summer of 1944, Dachau became the scene of one of the most atrocious experiments disguised as medical research. At the behest of the Luftwaffe and with the backing of the military high command, doctors Hans Eppinger and Wilhelm Beigelberg began a study to discover how a German pilot could survive if stranded at sea without access to drinking water. The logic on the surface was scientific: find a method to make seawater drinkable. But to test it, they chose disposable bodies, prisoners. 44 Roma, mostly Sinti, were selected, transported from Buchenwald, along with 4 others already held captive at Dachau. They were divided into groups. Some were completely denied water, others were given pure salt water. A third group received salt water disguised as fresh water, a fourth, a mixture with a low salt content. There was no food, there was no rest. The only thing entering their bodies were solutions that killed them drop by drop. Salt water not only fails to quench thirst, it intensifies it to the point of madness. It draws fluid from the cells, causes vomiting, diarrhea, mouth ulcers, and rapid kidney failure. The kidneys become saturated with sodium. The liver swells to the point of collapse, and the brain, deprived of fluid balance, is invaded by fever, spasms, and mental confusion. By the 3rd day, the prisoners were crawling on the barrack floor, licking the freshly scrubbed boards in the hope of finding a clean drop. They rummaged through old rags, buckets of dirty water, or mud puddles. One witness recounted how they gaped their mouths on wet stones in the courtyard, trying to absorb the moisture like animals. Another described desperate struggles to drink their own urine. The pain was constant, the cramps unbearable. Convulsions came without warning. Some hallucinated. They thought they saw fountains, rain, overflowing cups. Others could only scream for water until their throats tore out. No one slept. No one lasted for long, and as in so many other experiments at Dachau, no one survived. Joseph Chofenig, a prisoner assigned to the camp's medical department, witnessed that hell firsthand. He operated the X-ray machine and, thanks to his job, had access to documents, reports, and medical records. He knew exactly what was happening but was powerless to stop it. In one of his statements, he crudely described how the prisoners forced to drink salt water could no longer eat. Their bodies rejected everything. They vomited blood, thick saliva, and whitish foam. He remembered seeing one of them, skeletal, his lips open in bleeding cracks, kneeling on the tile floor, sucking dirty water from a rag. They were no longer trying to survive. They just wanted the suffering to end. Chofenig also recounted the fate of a comrade who had witnessed one of the decompression experiments from the infirmary. He said nothing, didn't intervene. But Rasher knew he had been there. His response was blunt. He ordered him sent directly to the gas chamber for examination. Was this his way of eliminating an inconvenient witness? The doctors who designed these experiments never drank the prescribed water, not a single drop. Yet they measured, recorded, and coldly compared every piece of data. Eppinger proclaimed his results to be promising. Beigelberg, in his defense, asserted that he had only fulfilled his scientific duty. Behind those words was the image of men with tongues blackened by thirst, sunken and dry eyes, blue-tinged nails, perforated stomachs, and completely broken souls. The human body needs water to live. At Dachau, water became a weapon for killing. Between 1942 and 1945, Dachau was transformed into a laboratory for induced diseases. The aim was not to cure or prevent. The objective was to observe the progressive destruction of the human body, treated as a simple test tube with legs. One of the priorities of the Third Reich was to combat malaria, not for humanitarian reasons, but as a matter of military strategy. The fronts in Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans were riddled with swampy areas infested with mosquitoes, and if they couldn't eliminate the insect, they had to strengthen the soldier. Science, devoid of ethics and in the service of extermination, found in the prisoners an inexhaustible supply of victims. More than 1,200 healthy inmates, mostly strong young men, were condemned to a slow and irreversible death. They were immobilized in special rooms where infected Anopheles mosquitoes were bred. Cages filled with insects were placed on their arms, legs, and bare torsos. Bite after bite, the parasite entered the bloodstream, and then the fever began. Heads pounded like drums, eyes burned, the body shook with endless chills, muscles cramped painfully. Some were delirious, screaming names no one knew. Others simply gave up. Not everyone received treatment. Some were abandoned to observe the natural course of the disease. Others were subjected to experimental drugs, mepecrine, atabrine, chloroquine, and synthetic derivatives in increasingly higher doses. The goal wasn't to cure, but to test how much fever, how many days of agony, and what exact dose could kill. Reactions included vomiting, diarrhea, hallucinations, and irreversible organ damage. Sometimes more resistant strains were even inoculated to study possible cross-immunity. More than half died. Those who survived were left with devastating after-effects, paralysis, partial blindness, liver failure, cognitive impairment, and permanent neurological damage. Dr. Claus Schilling, responsible for these experiments, was no amateur. He had directed the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Italy and was considered one of Europe's leading experts on infectious diseases. But at Dachau, he became a methodical killer. He didn't ask for volunteers, he demanded victims. He even sent direct requests to Himmler for more test subjects. At Nuremberg, Oswald Pohl singled him out as the perpetrator of the largest medical experiment at the camp. He said he had protested to Himmler about Schilling's excessive ambition. Nothing changed. The deaths continued one after another, recorded in cold clinical reports, as if each life lost were nothing more than a piece of data in a table. The flow of corpses was constant, but Dachau was not the only scene of these horrors. Between 1943 and 1945, other camps such as Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler joined the chain of infectious experiments. In these places, the focus was on viral hepatitis, then called epidemic jaundice, and the search for a vaccine that would protect German troops from the Allied advance and the deplorable sanitary conditions at the front. To this end, healthy prisoners were selected and deliberately contaminated with the virus either through intravenous injections or by introducing the pathogen through open cuts in the skin. The disease progressed rapidly. Within a few days, the victim's skin took on a deep yellow hue, their eyes turned mustard-colored, and their livers became so swollen that they deformed their abdomens. Stools turned white, urine darkened to brown, and fevers exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Some fell into a hepatic coma, others died in convulsions. There was no treatment. The few who survived underwent biopsies without anesthesia, blood samples were taken, and they were forced to continue working in the fields. When they were no longer useful, they were discarded, some executed, others left to die of starvation. The doctors responsible for these atrocities were not isolated lunatics. They were part of the Reich's military medical apparatus, under the direct supervision of auditors, health inspectors, and senior officers of the Army Medical Corps. Many of these experiments were designed in collaboration with universities, research institutes, laboratories, and pharmaceutical companies. It was a machine of knowledge that avoided looking the people it destroyed in the eye. The victims had no names. They were simple medical records. Patient A, patient B, a patient who didn't respond to treatment eliminated from the protocol. The concentration camp was the perfect laboratory for crime. No ethics, no press, no lawyers, no possibility of escape. Decisions that elsewhere would be called by their true names, torture, murder, mutilation, were recorded there as research, national necessity, or report to Berlin. One of the few witnesses who survived to tell the tale was Joseph Pfennig, a prisoner forced to work at the Dachau Medical Center. He operated the X-ray machine, which gave him access to medical records and charts. He knew what was happening, but he couldn't stop it. In his testimony, he described unforgettable scenes. A man, forced to drink only salt water, trying to soothe his agony by sucking on a warder's soaked mop. Another prisoner, an accidental witness to a pressure experiment, sent to the gas chamber on Rasher's orders. At Dachau, seeing was dangerous. Knowing was a crime. Years later, some of these studies were cited in scientific journals without mentioning their source. Some researchers defended their value, arguing that they had saved lives or provided unique data. Others denounced the monstrosity of such reasoning. Can knowledge born of unjustifiable pain be considered progress? Can medicine be built on corpses without history? The answer seemed obvious, but not for everyone. In 1946, the Nuremberg tribunal tried several of the doctors involved. Claus Schilling was convicted, as was Wilhelm Beigelböck. Others escaped. Some were even recruited by the Allies for secret projects. Many original documents were classified. For years, field experiments were cited without clarifying that the camps were concentration camps, that the victims screamed, that they weren't numbers, that they had names. Today, we know that much of these experiments produced no real progress. The drugs were ineffective, the methods invalid, the data inconsistent. The bodies were destroyed in vain.